Hi, my name is Daryl LeBar. In this video, I'm going to walk through how to set up automated testing of CRM using open source tools. And I'm specifically going to be talking about testing through the IORGANIZATIONSERVIce and faking that service out using two open source tools that are available right now on GitHub and on NuGet. So let's get started. First things first, disclaimers. When I say unit testing, I probably more accurately mean automated testing or integration testing or functional testing. Unit testing technically is a very precise method of automated testing where you're testing a very small piece of code, generally only one single method. We're dealing primarily with CRM as CRM developers testing the I plugin or the I code activity. So for workflows and plugins. So generally, almost all my testing is going to go through that actual method, since that's really technically the only public-facing thing that the plugin, that CRM is going to see. So when I say unit testing, I mean probably a sum of automated integration and functional testing, not just unit testing. I'm going to skip the why in this speech. I'm not going to. There's plenty of reasons why unit testing is great. Fewer bugs, test-driven development, behavioral-driven development, safer to refactor, etc. There's tons of reasons. I don't. This is not to try to convince you that testing is the way to go. This is to go, okay, I want to do testing. Where do I get started? So, getting started. In this video, I'm going to talk about two open source libraries specifically. The first is called Fake XRM Easy. It's created by Jordi Montagna. It's on GitHub. He also has it available on NuGet. If you search for Fake XRM Easy on NuGet, you can find it there. It's primarily a fake CRM service. He has support for plugins and for workflow faking. There is a dependency on Fake It Easy. That's what he's using to do all the mocking in it. And there is some great documentation available for you. Great job showing an overview of how to do it, and it actually looks really pretty. And I'll see if I can actually go to that website real quick. Here on his website is a great example of installation. Walks through the steps, gives a little animation here. You can skip it if you want, but it looks kind of nice to be able to read it and not have to be distracted by other things. Walk through your first test, how to test a plugin, how to test the code activity as well. So those are great, the great documentation that he has for that. So that's the first one, Fake XRM Easy. The second one is XRM Unit Test. This is something that I created. It's on GitHub as well as on NuGet. I started working on this probably 3 years ago and finally open sourced it within the last year. So it's kind of funny that both Jordi and I came up with almost identical, some of the code looks almost identical, identical usage of the actual framework. And it's funny how we both developed it on different continents and different sides of the world and all that kind of stuff. But we both had the same problem. We both saw the same solution, although we've gone about it in slightly different ways. So the XRM Unit Test is not only just a fake CRM service, it is also some more. There's assumptions that are built in. I'll go into that a little bit later. Entity builders, etc. It also comes with a very large library, dlb.xrm, that contains lots of helper methods and extension methods as well to hopefully make your life simpler as a CRM developer. It has fluent support for plugin and workflow faking. So I make the extensive use of fluent builders in order to fake out the plugins and the workflows. There is no dependency on any mocking framework. There's no dependency on any testing framework. So you can choose whatever framework you want and test it how you normally would. It has no other dependencies, so you're not limited to anything else. It has sucky documentation. I'm working on it, but it is not that great at all. Hopefully I'll get some videos up here very quickly, and I'll show some more examples, and this is a great way to get started with this video and this actual walkthrough. So, now that we've got started, let's go ahead and go for a spin. I'm going to walk through unit test 1. So when you go and you create a new unit test project, and go and create a new test, it's called unit test 1. So this is going to be our first basic file. We're going to walk through some basic comparisons. we're going to be testing a piece of code called make name match case. So this is a hypothetical piece of code where you want to say, hey, if someone is named McDonald, I want to make sure that D in their name, McDonald, that first D is capitalized. I want to make sure that casing matches. I have a capital B in the middle of my last name, and it's a rather unusual last name, and so I always am telling people, hey, capitalize my last name. So this is something that feels good to me, but it's a very hypothetical piece of code. We're going to walk through testing both using Microsoft Fakes. So this is how you do it without this sort of testing framework in place, like Fake XRM Easy and XRM Unit Test has. We'll show how the Fake XRM Easy utilizes the early bound entities for context the same way that the XRM Unit Test does, and how it's arranged to look like standard code. And then we'll see how the XRM Unit Test is almost identical to that. So real quick, go to our test project here, and go to our test file. So our first test here, and I'm using this namespacing of saying, hey, what is the thing I'm testing? Make name match case underscore. What is my state that I'm testing? Name is McDonald, lowercase d. Should, and then what is the actual state that I'm expecting? Update to McDonald. And then here I'm post-fixing that with MS-Fakes because this is the MS-Fakes version of this test. So this is how you would test this if you didn't have any CRM-specific framework for testing, and you didn't want to use, and you needed to use the standard open source standard libraries that are available for you for testing it. So I'm going to follow in all my tests an arrange, act, and assert, where you set up all the test data in the arrange, you do the actual action, and then you do the assert. So let's take a look at the arrange here. I've got an entity here. I've got this Microsoft.xrm.SDK.fakes.stub IORGANIZATION service. The way you generate this is just going to your actual DLL, your plugin, and your unit test here, picking that DLL and saying add fakes assembly, and it'll go through and create this little fakes file and generate an actual fakes assembly that contains all this stuff. So it's very helpful for testing things that you don't have access to, and it allows you to test CRM, but it's we could do a lot better. Let's just say that. So we have this service here, and we're saying, okay, execute organization request. That's an actual method on the service. We're going to fake that out. This execute request accepts an organization request and returns an organizational response. So our method's going to do the same exact thing here. This is the request that's coming in. I'm checking to say, hey, is it retrieve multiple requests? If it is, then I'm going to handle it. If not, I'm checking to see if it's an update request. And if it is, I'm going to handle it. So real quick, let's go look at the actual code to see what it is that we're attempting to fake out, what we need to fake out. So here's our code, make name match case. Passing in a service, generating a CRM context. So this is an early bound context that you get from generating the assemblies, from CRM service util.exe, or you can use the early bound generator from the XRM Tools plugins, XRM Toolbox plugins that I created, as well as multitudes of other open source generators out there. So here's a context set. We're going to go get all the contexts where the first name is equal to the name that's passed in, or the last name is equal to the name that's passed in. So in this case, we're passing McDonald, and we're trying to find everyone that has McDonald as that name. So I'm grabbing all those, and I'm just getting the first name and last name back. To listing it so it actually gets converted here to an actual list. The call's done here. And now we actually loop through each one. I'm using this method strings are equal, but case is not. So if the strings are equal, first name and last name, but the case is not, I'm getting that returned. So at this point in time, we know the first name and the name are the same text values, just the casing is different. I update that and update the object. Same thing here as well. Save changes, that'll save changes back to CRM, and boom, we're done. Here's a strings are equal but not case is not method. All it's doing is saying, hey, I want it where they are not equal, but they are equal if I ignore the actual case. So back to where we are with the fakes. Actually, I'm going to go back down again. Things we have to actually fake out here. This context is going to actually do a query here, retrieve multiple. It's also going to do an update here on that actual object. So those are the two things that we need to fake out in order for this test to actually be successful. We'll go back to the test. First thing I'm doing is, again, making sure that I know what requests I'm parsing. I have two options this time, retrieve multiple and an update request. If it's retrieve multiple requests, I go ahead and generate my response. Hey, it's retrieve multiple response. I'm adding my actual contact that I want in here, so lowercase d McDonald, and I'm returning that response back. If it's an update, I'm going through and I'm grabbing whatever that target is, so whatever that's attempting to be updated in CRM. I'm setting it to this update entity, and that's up here, and that's outside of that context. And now I can test it down here in my assert and say, hey, I want to make sure that it's not null, so I've actually got it set, and I want to make sure the name is updated. So if I go to my unit tests, and I go and test the MS tests, go ahead and run that test. Completed in just under half a second. So not too bad. I'd like to be a little bit faster. If I ran again, maybe it would be a little bit faster, but okay. So half a second to go through and test that. Here's the part that's really bad about this, though. We are doing absolutely no checking in this request to see what it is that it's attempting to retrieve. So if I happen to have an error in here where, let's say that I am not including, let's say I've done this instead, where I did the first name twice rather than the first name and the last name. It's potentially a typo, but it's not going to fail in the XRM test. So if I go and run that test, because we're not looking at anything in that actual request, this is going to say, hey, you passed, and there it is. Passed 387 milliseconds. Even though this is a serious bug in it. And that's because you're not actually testing everything in there that you could possibly test. You're faking that call out since it's too hard, quote unquote, too hard to do that normally. So great, that's done. Now let's go on to the next step. Let's go look at what it looks like for the fake XRM Easy. Notice this code is a lot smaller. It's fitting in my whole screen here. Same naming convention, except it's fake XRM Easy at the end here. I'm getting a new faked context. I'm giving it a proxy type assembly based on my CRM context. So this basically says, hey, I want you to use my these types for my proxy type assembly. Then it gets a fake organization service off of that. Now we got a service. Now it's creating. So this service, this CRM database is completely empty. We just created it. The only structure it knows about are our early bound entities that we've created. And now we actually do the create here. So service.create, and it passes in this new contact. So it's going to create a contact. Last name McDonald, first name Ron. Why not? Gives us back an ID. So this looks exactly like something you would do in CRM. It isn't this funky, weird stub thing you have to do here. So it's another really big benefit out of this. Everything else is very similar. We're doing the same exact act here, passing in a service, passing in the McDonald. Now we're asserting that McDonald, and then we're actually going to go retrieve, based on the entity of the ID that we created, we're going to actually go retrieve that entity out of CRM, and we're going to check its last name. As long as last name is now McDonald capital D rather than lowercase d, we should be happy. But remember, we put our little fake in here. We made our little boo-boo in here. So we're going to leave that in there. We're going to let that run, and it's going to fail. because this time we are actually testing our link statement here. Expected McDonald, actual McDonald. If I change this back, save it, test it again. Okay, there it is, completely successful. Awesome. So this actually tested this link statement. This link statement got parsed, and it passed it into the IORGANIZATIONSERVICE service, as you would expect in the actual request, execute request. And then the fake XRM easy context went through and parsed it and actually pulled out the contact that had been created. If we look at the actual XRM unit test version of this, it's almost exactly the same. Rather than that other context, I have a local CRM database organization service. Then I'm using this to say, hey, I need to create this. This is the information I need to create a database. Right now all I need is the actual early bound entities. And that returns back to me a service. And then I can call create in the service, actually do the service, and actually get the cert to be correct. So everything in here works just exactly like the fake XRM easy does. Okay. Run that, and there we go. Both of them succeeded. Now the one thing that's different here is I have added the first name in here. That's because currently there's a small bug and it's been fixed. It just hasn't been pushed out to NuGet yet for me to grab, where the name doesn't exactly match up, or the name, if the name's not populated, it's going to throw an error when it's attempting to actually go and look at that name. There we go. And the error is the attribute first name does not exist on this entity. There's a small bug where if you don't set it and you try to compare it, it doesn't like that. So it has been fixed. It will be fixed in the near future. So, but that brings up this major point. These things are not perfect. Not every single thing you could do in CRM can you do with the XRM fake context, or can you do with the XRM unit test. They're not perfect. They are very, very good, both of them, and they do really help to make your life a whole lot easier. Because looking at this code and writing this code and creating this code, especially if you take this whole line here, has absolutely nothing to do with the actual unit test itself. So you can create a base class or a base test method and pass that into your actual test method, or serve it to it. You're looking at the bare minimum number of lines of code. One line to arrange, one line to act, one line to assert. You don't get much better than that. So that's kind of the walkthrough of the different examples here. I'm going to change back the name here just so we can make sure those things all run. We'll run them all at the same time and make sure they also pass. There we go. Done. Now, back to where we were. Both the XRM unit tests and the fake XRM easy take advantage of the early bound entities to ensure that you are forcing yourself to be within the confines of what your CRM metadata is defined as. So basically what I'm saying is you can't create a random attribute and assume that it's going to work and it's going to be there. It's going to give you an error. Just like we saw in the fake XRM easy, it was giving an error when it shouldn't have, but you get the same type of error for fake XRM easy as XRM unit test if you attempt to set an attribute that does not exist in your early bound entities. So they work, basically the same exact way. Let's take a look at some of the limitations. We saw how it was great for being able to actually test our code, test our actual link statements. Let's talk about some of the actual limitations that these are going to provide here. We've looked at the actual we've kind of looked at high level how they've worked by using the early bound entities, but it's only as good as those early bound entities. So if your early bound entities that you have don't match your actual CRM organization, you're going to have tests that are going to be mix match. Some will fail when they shouldn't, some will succeed when they should. Some won't succeed when they should. Some other issues, you can't get the option set text values. The option sets exist, and you can get something very similar to them, but you can't actually get the option set text values by default. The entities may not match your environment, so we talked about they're different. Your tests aren't going to be as good as it could be otherwise. There's no security that's handled in either of these. In either of the frameworks, there's no security to make sure that you as a user have rights to go and perform this action. That's just something that would take a ludicrous amount of programming to be able to provide, on top of a ludicrous amount of programming to be able to define what your security roles each time you run a test. You don't want to be doing that. So it's not CRM. It will have bugs. It may not functionally match CRM, and it may not support everything you want or need. So it's not perfect, but it's very, very helpful. It also doesn't help when one environment is working and the other one is not. So if you have code, it's the same code, and it's in dev, and it's in QA, and one environment's working, one environment's not working, and your unit tests are passing, you got something else wrong. Your environments are different, and it doesn't give you a good way to test that. So how do we overcome those issues? We actually connect to CRM. And that's the largest and the first difference I'm going to show here between the fake XRM Easy and the XRM unit test is the XRM unit test allows you to switch back and forth between connecting to CRM and running locally in memory. So you can choose to have a dependency on CRM so you can test everything that the test framework doesn't do, or you can keep it all local and keep everything local as a true automated unit testing framework should be. So real quick, before we actually get to that point, let's talk about how do we actually configure it. The first thing you need to do is to create a test initializer to configure your unit test config path. This is where we're going to actually read some settings to determine what to connect to. Your early bound entities, this is the path to figure out what entities do I want to use so we don't have to define it each and every time. The test framework provider, this is just an interface that I wrote for it defines the method attributes and test failure exceptions so that if the test framework needs to throw an exception, it can and will be the correct type of exception for your framework, as well as knowing what methods, what attributes to look for to define this is actual test method. And finally, we're going to call the test base that get organization service after the test initialize test settings. So we're going to initialize our test settings, and then we're going to actually go and get an organization service. And at that point in time, it may be connected to CRM, it may be an in-memory fake service, just depends on what our settings are. So let's take a look at how that's implemented. Here's my test initializer here. This test initializer is out on the actual GitHub site. All these example projects are there. I've just removed them for this presentation, so that way it's easier to see just your stuff. This is what it would look like more than likely if you're doing your own unit testing. You have a plugin assembly, you have an actual testing assembly, and then I highly recommend, you don't have to, and I highly recommend creating this third little DLL, this third little project DLL reference, that's just your test base. So you can share it against multiple unit test projects. So I like following the convention of having a unit test project per project you actually are testing. So in this case, if you have multiple DLLs, or maybe you have a plugin DLL and a workflow DLL, you have a separate unit test, or separate test project for each DLL. And then they both can reference this one place, and in this one project, you can define your settings for is it or is it not connected to the actual CRM instance itself. So test initializer settings. In the dlb.xrm.test namespace, there's this little test settings that you set. So this test initializer isn't anything special. It's just you can call it whatever you want, you can create whatever you want, you can do it however you want, but somewhere before your actual code runs, you need to go through and call this stuff so that the test framework knows this information. First is this assumption XML path. I'm not going to dive into that right now. We'll go into that later. Second is the unit test or the user test config path. So that's just the path to this user settings.user.config. That's right here. What I've gone through and done is I have a unit test settings.config, and this is the one that you can share amongst your whole team. If you happen to have a service account in here, you can go ahead and put it in. You can list all of your connection settings to connect to all of your environments in here if you want. And then when someone brand new on the project comes and they get latest, it's going to generate this unit test user config settings for them. In this case, I've managed to delete my version. Okay, so that file itself is supposed to be skipped from the source control, but in this case, I switched to a different branch, and that branch deleted it because it wasn't supposed to be there. When it came back, it was gone. So we'll go through and we'll generate that when we need it, and we can actually see that happen. So that's kind of fun. So entity builder, I'll skip over this as well, but this is just a way to define how your entity should be created by default. Our early bound settings, so this is our actual context that we're going to go use to actually get our early bound entities to use for figuring out what's real and what's not real, as well as for connecting to CRM, it needs an information as well. And finally, this is test framework provider. If I take a little look at this one, it has to implement this interface, test framework provider. I need the attribute for what the test method is, a get failed exception, and get inconclusive exception. So these are exceptions that the framework will throw if there's an issue. So by default, these are the MS test provider ones. So if you're using MS test, you can copy and paste this code and good to go. All right, so that's a test initializer. That's what we need in order to connect to CRM. This is something you'll have to wire up in order to use XRM unit tests. So let's see an example of actually doing that. I'm going to go back here to our make name test. This time I'm going to hit the server version here. Okay. So this looks very similar. Oh, there's a little bit difference to it. So now we're calling this initialize test settings. Calling this get organization service. Okay, that's going to turn back a service. This is using our test base, so I just have a test base here that sits in this actually sits in dlb.xrm.test, and that's utilizes those test settings that we created and actually will give you back your service based on those settings. And the rest of the test is very similar, except we have this try finally here. Since we don't know, there's nothing here telling us at this point in time whether we're connected to CRM or we're running in local. We need to go through and clean up what we're actually running with. If we don't, we may get some issues. Plus, we'll put lots of junk data in our environment. We don't necessarily want to do that. Although if you're set up to automatically clean up and restore environments at will, maybe you don't care about that, and it's not that big of a deal, and you can go ahead and do that as much as you'd like. For most of the places that I've been at in the last couple of years, they don't just bring up an environment all the time, and they don't want to keep the environment semi-clean for testing to make sure that they know what this is and what that is, and everything is valid data and not just test data where we're creating the bare minimum amount of information required in order to run the test. So we have our same test here, same assert here, and at the end here we go through and we delete the actual entity. So let's first, before we do that, we need to, well, let's first, go ahead and run this first. What it's going to do when we run it is it's going to add our file here, our unit test settings.config file. This is, yep. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll run that test. And in this case, since we just pulled off a source control, it's going to run in memory because I haven't specified it to run outside of memory. So by default, it runs against in memory, so that way you can pull latest on your build server and run in memory and not have any dependencies on anything else. So great, did that. Now if we look at our example test here, here's our file, it just got added. I don't want to add it to source control, but I do want to actually include it. So here it's just a straight copy of whatever this is, and then we can go ahead and change whatever we want here. So I'm going to change that to false. I have a server URL I need to enter. So I'll go look up, as this is for online, so that's great. I need to change my org name here. So this way, if you've got multiple environments, you don't have to have a whole connection string. You just can change your org name for whatever org you need to point to, QA or test. And then down here we have a password, and also a full name format that gets honored whenever naming conventions are created. So first, initial, last, whatever setting is. So primarily, you won't need to worry about that until you ever run a unit test where it becomes a problem. So I put this thing way down here, so that way when you're looking at your settings and someone's sitting with you, they don't go and see your actual password in here. And it doesn't get checked into TFS or into your source control versioning system, so you don't have to worry about being in source control. So real quick, I'm going to go ahead and add my settings. Okay, I've gone ahead and added the password. Super secret, can't see it. I've got my organization name here now, and I've changed my local CRM database to say, hey, false. If you're on a on-prem environment and you want to use your certain AD credentials, you can use this to set certain AD credentials. If not, it's going to use your default credentials that Visual Studio is using. So I'm using online, so don't worry about that. Now I'm going to run it against CRM. So use local CRM is going to be false. Now I go back to my Test Explorer, and just to make sure that we can show that we're actually doing this, I'm going to put a breakpoint right after our act here before we do our assert. You can debug it. Okay. It's running. It's connecting. You'll find that running against CRM itself it takes a lot longer. Okay, we had a bug. Okay, so apparently I didn't know how to spell virtual when I stopped running. I didn't know how to spell virtual when I created this, and so this is actually the XRM Virtual unit test rather than the XRM Virtual unit test. So let's go ahead and see if that works any better. And I guess it might help it if I actually typed in my username. There we go. Cool. Let's give that a shot. Passwords are great. They don't work without usernames, unfortunately. Third time's the charm. Nope. I'm sorry for that intermission. I fixed my issue and went through and tested, and everything appeared to be working just fine, but I forgot to go through and turn on my recording. So I'm going to back up now and attempt to start off where I last left off. So I believe where I last left off was I was attempting to connect to CRM. I've got my settings correct now, where I spelled virtual wrong with just missing one R, and then I forgot that R, and then I also didn't put in my username, which is also a rather large requirement for connecting to something. And that was about it. So I'm back here. I'm on the server test. I'm going to go ahead and run the server test. And I'm going to put a breakpoint here to show that when I'm actually connecting, that I actually have that entity in CRM itself. So I'm in the XRM Virtual rather than Virtual. I've gone to here. I've already created an ID. There it is, lowercase. I'm going to allow that one method to execute. It's finished. Refresh. Uppercase. I don't know if you can see that very well. Now it's in uppercase. Cool. So that's working great. I've asserted that. Now we can assert this thing's capital D. It is. Great. Good to go. Now we go through and actually delete it to clean it up. I don't want the test data sitting out there if I don't have to have it. And you could potentially have an issue if you happen to have some system setting entity that should only have one version of it. If you have to create it each time, you need to delete it afterwards, or else you're going to have some major issues. So always clean it up. And that should be the end of our test. Should pass. And there we go. Pass. Cool. So that's our server test here. We've connected. We've done that. Now, though, connecting to CRM presents a whole new list of issues. We need it to be agnostic in our test environments, so we need to clean up our previous data. We also need to handle or potentially be aware of any plugins that we are registered in our actual CRM environment that are executing while your unit test is executing. So this happens a lot if you've got a test that a unit, let's say you have a plugin that goes through and updates some information upon creation. Well, when you go and you create your test data, or let's say on update rather than create. Let's say you go ahead and you create your data and then you go ahead and update it. Your update method to update it is going to trigger your plugin to fire again. So you may have a slight issue, depending. You may have a slight issue at times making sure that your plugin that actually exists in your CRM environment isn't stepping on your unit test, and you may have to write some code to go through and handle that. We also have to specify how to connect to local versus server. You could do it per unit test, but then you're going to have duplicate of all your unit tests, and that's anything but dry. And as we've shown already, the example really is we want it just to work out of the box in one single point, and so that's the user test configuration file that we've got. We'll have some boilerplating here we need to take care of. We don't want to be initializing the test settings each and every method. We also don't want to be having to create this organization service each time. We just want to get it passed in. We also have to handle this issue. What happens if I create my contact here? I get to this point, I put a breakpoint in here and go, nope, I need to change something. And I click stop. Well, my finally won't ever run. So now I'm going to have data that's sitting out there that I don't want to have sitting out there that should have gotten cleaned up, but there's no way to prevent it when you're running with a debugger, or you get when you're running with a debugger, there's no way to prevent that from actually getting cleaned up. So we have to handle cleaning up both pre and post data each time our test runs. Some other things we want to make sure we have in our test environments, or our test framework. We want to have a simple way to create unique data for each test. That way we could be environment agnostic. I can point to QA, I can point to dev, I can point to stage, I can point to prod if I need to in the worst situations, and figure out what exactly is going on. Why is this not working in this environment? Oh, I am missing this attribute in this environment. Or, oh, I've got a key, I've got a alternate key on this entity in this environment that's preventing this duplicate record from being created. Whatever it happens to be. We want to clean up data both post-test and pre-test. I mean, we need that single point that controls whether it's a fake CRM or real CRM call. We also need to be able to ensure that we don't get data into CRM that we don't know about. So when we're running a test and in the test, let's say our plugin itself creates a record, we want to make sure we can specify that ID and prevent that ID from prevent the entity from being created unless we've expected that to happen. We also want to make it easy to figure out, hey, test data has been created that needs to be cleaned up. And the final and the most important thing here is we want to make sure that our cost justifies our benefit. So whatever framework we use needs to make us extremely productive. Here's a little graph here of our little bell curve of what happens when you're doing unit testing. It takes a little bit to get off the ground, but once you get off the ground, you start seeing huge returns on your investment, returns on your effort. Then after a while, you start seeing decreasing returns for a lot of additional effort. And you have to decide, before you do anything, you have to decide where on your bell curve are you going to spend most of your time as well. If you're NASA and you're sending a ship to Mars with humans in it, you're going to want to spend a lot of time way over here and doing tons of work to make sure everything's perfect. Because one mistake in production is bad. You can't handle it. But for most of us, our sweet spot's going to be living in here. And we just want to make this as high as possible for the minimum amount of effort. So that's where the XRM unit test framework kind of comes in to help make that possibility. Help is on the way here. Okay. The primary method that I use in order to make this as efficient as possible is a test method class base. It favors convention over configuration. I like to call that magic or automagical. Lots of things it does seems automagical, but you can configure it if you need to. You could think of MVC. Seems to be a pretty good example of things just happen as long as you know the convention. Oh, I need to name my parameters this way. If I do it this way, magic happens and things happen that are the way that I want to happen. So it's a convention over configuration approach to minimize the amount of code needed. It utilizes these IDs classes to help set up and tear down the test data. And IDs can be nested if need be. It creates the IORganization service for you. And the IORganization service has some wrapping around it already that logs all the requests so you can actually see what did I actually execute. It forces that IDs are actually defined by the entities that are being created to make sure you're not creating junk data. It will also go through and set the name, if appropriate, for these entities. So contact's a bad example, since CRM will set that name for you automatically. There's the magic word, automatically. But for, let's say, a custom entity that has a standard name on it, prefix underscore name, this will take the actual name of the actual unit test it's running and set that as the name in CRM itself. That way when you're in CRM, you go, oh, I need to rerun this test to clean up the data. It also has entity environment builders. These are Fluent builders to help create your entities and define how each entity should be created by default. And this helps to decrease the code required to initialize the test. So let's go ahead and take a look at this test method class in action. So if I look at test method class, okay, test method. First thing I do is, the only thing I do in this actual test method is create my class and call test on it. Class inherits from this test method class base. We have this struct IDs in here. Okay, so this is a little bit automagical. As long as you have a struct in your test method class, the base will go and find it when it runs, and it'll go find any property, any field that exists in it that is of type ID. And if it exists, then it's going to go through and it's going to delete that entity, or it's going to attempt to delete it beforehand if it exists, and it's going to delete it after it exists. So this is all that's required to clean up our test data, before and after. In our previous, we had this final here that worked just after. We had to write a for, and I didn't write it in this case. In this case, this handles both the before and the after for as many entities as you want to throw at it. Then we have an initialized test data in here. So here's where we're actually doing the arrange for the test in this case. I don't actually call it out since I'm in a method called initialized test data, so that's pretty much arrange. But we're taking this contact that we have. We've defined the ID here. Let's go in. We're saying, hey, this contact has a property called entity that is of the whatever that type is. So this generic class. This is an actual contact. Last name, and set it to lowercase McDonald. That's what we've done in all of our other tests. Then I'm using this environment builder to create that entity. So it's going to go through and it's going to create all the entities I've defined in the struct here. If I need to do a specific one, I can. But it's all Fluent, so you can say specific things if you want. If I want to exclude one, if I want to say, hey, don't create this one particular ID, but create everything else, you can do that as well. But it's all Fluent, so you keep on adding to it as you need. And then the final step is to create the actual entities. Now in my test case, I don't have an arrange because I'm doing all that in my test initialize. I do have an act, I do have an assert. So the same exact act, pretty much the same exact assert. Let's go ahead and give this one a whirl. Okay, I'm still pointing to CRM itself. We can go and look out in the actual CRM instance itself to see the record get created and cleaned up. But we won't in this case, just to make things a little bit faster. Cool. All right, done. Now it took about 8 seconds. When we're running in memory, we're running less sub-second normally. So it makes a big difference when you connect to CRM. So it's only something that I would recommend doing when you actually need to. So I always run through and I create my tests first locally in memory, and then I do just a one test against the server itself just to make sure that something isn't messed up or the framework itself is doing something that shouldn't be allowed or whatever. But I do that just to make sure that we actually have everything working both in memory and locally, and then I go back to local. So I'm going to switch back to local now so I don't have to wait for that to happen again. This is super hard here. Go through, change it to true. Now we're going to run local next time we run those tests. So another thing that this did for us is we can actually look at our output here. Output actually tells us what we did and tells us how long it took. So it took us about almost 5 seconds to go out and retrieve this, run the SQL statement basically. Select star, actually there's no star there, but select from contact where the contact ID is in this list of IDs. So that's our pre-data. It didn't find anything, so it didn't need to clean anything up, so the pre-data test cleanup is done. Now it's actually doing the test. It's running the test data initializer. It took about half a second to go through and create that record. Now it's going to go through and do another retrieve within our actual plugin where the name is McDonald or McDonald. Actually the first name and last name. And then finally our cert, actually the plugin then updates that entity. You see that call there, 342 milliseconds. We retrieve the entity again as a part of our search. Time to run the test took a second, 1,071 milliseconds. We had another execute multiple at the end, took another second, and then it took another second to delete. So you get to see where exactly, what's taken so long for this test to run through. And primarily we're just waiting on CRM. Huge one in that initialize the retrieve multiple and as well down here. So there's just time that it's waiting on CRM. But you get to see all of that and you can see exactly what's being executed and potentially see something that's executing that you don't think or you didn't think actually needing to be executed or was actually executing. So that's our test method class base example here. Let's see a real world example here. So we have a hypothetical plugin called sync account to contact. This isn't the best idea, but let's say this plugin will fire on update of a contact. It'll find all accounts that have the contact as the primary contact and are missing an address 1. Then it's going to sync those address 1 and it's going to sync those address 1 values from the contact to the account. And we're going to dive into another layer here, which is using the DLB plugin handler base. And the only thing this is doing is this is just defining in code, and there's something very similar in the SDK examples of a plugin base, but this is a little bit more typed than just typing in strings and int values and stuff like that. But it's going to prevent, in the actual SDK it doesn't prevent anything, it just lists it. But in this case, it's going to actually prevent that plugin from firing unless that context holds that case to be true. So let's go take a look at this thing. Name of this thing is the sync account to contact. Okay, cool. So here's our test method again. Now we're creating two entities, an account and a contact. Our initialized test data is we're setting the primary contact ID of the account to the contact. And then we're going through and creating everything. So nothing too difficult here. We have our range. Okay, so for our range, we're going to actually pass into this plugin that, hey, I have a contact, and the contact has this address line 1 via part of an update. So if we look at the actual plugin itself, sync account, contact to account, I have this little plugin base. All it's doing is calling this get plugin handler, and this is a way to get around some issues with allowing you to override a method that gets called on the actual constructor. So that plugin, that class is just basically calling this logic class. This logic class is registering these events here. It says, hey, I'm only going to run on the post operation of a create or an update for entities, in this case, contact build. So that's another Fluent example of something that we're going to run through, and it's going to say, okay, only execute this if it's a post operation, if it's a create or an update, and it's a contact entity. If it is, it's going to go ahead and call this execute internal. So the first thing it does is it gets the actual contact from the target, goes through and says, hey, does the contact have an address? It does. Or if it doesn't, I'm going to go ahead and skip this because there's nothing to update anyways. If it does, it goes ahead and connects to CRM, goes and gets all accounts. That primary contact ID is that contact, loops through all the accounts, and updates all the address information on it, setting everything from the contact to the account, and then calling update on it just to update the actual account. So that's all it's doing. Flipping through, doing that for every single one. So if we go back to our unit test here, we have our contact, we have our plugin. Now comes kind of the fun part of what we actually need to do. Our plugin has an execute method. This is the I plugin execute, right? It expects an I service provider. So I've got a service provider builder that gives and requires a service. It requires a I plugin execution context. That's the actual context you get out of the provider. And it also requires a logger, so that you can actually log things to the actual output window of the test. So that's the provider. Well, where do I get the service? I'm getting in from the actual parameter. Logger, I'm getting in from the actual test method class itself. It defines a logger there. Context, I've got to create a context. What's a context? It's an I plugin execution context. What do I have? A plugin execution context builder. So I'm going to create this builder, this plugin execution context. I want it to run with the first registered event for that plugin. So whatever that first registered event is for that plugin, it's going to go and set the context to be that. So it's going to set both the message type, whether it's a pre or a post, and the logical name of the entity. Then also I'm going to pass in the target here of my plugin, of my contact here, so that gets passed in. And that's arranging all that stuff. So now I've got all that stuff arranged in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. Basically, I've mocked out or faked out my provider here. Call the plugin execute method as you normally would call, and then do our asserts. Go get our account out and make sure our address line 1 of the contact now matches the address line 1 of our account. So let's go ahead and run that test. Sync contact to account. Cool. We're gonna run it. We're gonna run it locally this time. If we want to run against the CRM server, we could do it. We'll run locally this time. Boom. That's it. So it took around 2 seconds, it said. Now we'll run the fake XRM easy way. So I've also done this, mocked this out the same way, or faked this out with the fake XRM easy. If I go to that one, it's going to look similar, but a little bit different. The fake XRM easy is always, you always have to keep track of this context to say what database you're actually connecting to, basically. And it also keeps track of, actually, is what's used to actually execute your plugin as well. I don't personally like it quite as much. I like the Fluent builders much, much better. They seem to be a lot more flexible and a lot easier to find things and that kind of stuff. But hey, to each their own, I guess. It still works very well, though. So here's the context. We'll go ahead and get the assembly. So this is the proxy type assemblies. This is the whole setup that we did before. This stuff can easily be handled in a base class. Now we get into the actual arranging of the test methods, or the test data. We have our contact. We're creating that contact, getting the ID. We are now creating the account. Getting the account. We're setting the ID of the contact to the account. So all this sort of, hey, creating this and setting this to that sort of stuff, that all happened in the test method class in this CRM environment builder just by setting that value. It did everything else for us. So that cuts out quite a bit of code, really. Now we have our act. So now you have to use that context. rather than the plugin itself. We never actually create the plugin in the actual unit test, which seems a little bit strange to me. But it actually goes through and it says, okay, this is the plugin you want. I'm going to go ahead and create it, and I'm going to go ahead and test it. So I'm creating it, and then the context I'm passing in, I can define basically everything on the iPlugin execution context. I can define here. I'm not sure what you can do with the actual trace logger. I don't know if there's a logger for it. I don't think there is. Let's see if there's anything else that's on the context with trace log. Nope. Okay. So I don't see anything there, but so that way you don't actually get anything in your output here. For ours, we have for the sync count address, we have the output that says what we actually did. So that's another thing that you don't necessarily get with the fake XRM Easy. But it's very young and these working very fast, so that's great. So that's the difference between the fake and the XRM unit. It's very similar, except that you're dealing with the context rather than dealing with the plugin itself. And with the XRM unit test, you kind of work backwards with, oh, I need a provider. Everything's based on take away the I from the interface that you want to create from CRM. And there's a builder for that one, and you build that specific one and add in whatever you need to add and kind of work yourself up the chain. Up, I need a provider needs a context needs a target, and kind of work yourself up the chain if you need to. So that's our real world example here. We'll compare the apples to the oranges here. We already kind of did that. Let's see here what changes. Similar ranges, acts are similar except a context versus the plugin. Almost identical asserts. And the fake XRM Easy was 42 lines of code versus 49 lines of code for the XRM unit test. And the beautiful part about the fake XRM Easy is there's no additional setup beyond that NuGet package. So if you want to get started within minutes, that is the way to go once you've got, as long as you have your early bound entities created. And if you need to go create your early bound entities, that's why I created the early bound entity generator for you to go ahead and do that using the XRM toolbox as a way to connect to CRM, and so you don't have to worry about creating that weird connection string. XRM unit test, in those 49 lines of code, we also can run against a real CRM instance, and it also records all times and all organization service requests made, so that's an additional benefit. So we did plugin testing. Next is workflow testing. So all the other unit tests for IORGANIZATIONSERVICE, faking is identical, so there's really no need to dive more into that. So we'll just take a look at the one little tweak that has to happen for the workflow creation. So if we go look at the create account, let's see what one was it? Create account. Nope, create GUID. Create GUID activity. Okay, so I've got this rather simple activity here, create GUID activity. All it does is it outputs a GUID. So if for some weird reason you need a GUID rather than entity reference as a part of workflow, great, here's a way to do it. All it does is it takes no inputs and just generates GUID and returns it back to its output parameter as a string, so then you can reference that as a part of your workflow. Notice the code activity, if you're looking at an actual workflow for CRM, is from system.activities.code activity. It is not CRM specific, it is workflow specific. Windows workflow specific even. So don't make that, that's why the actual unit test looks a little bit different. So if we look at the actual unit test first, we'll look at the fake XRM Easy one. We have our fake context. We execute our code activity. Creates our GUID of this actual create GUID activity, so it's very similar to the plugins where you're not actually creating your workflow, you're saying this is the actual thing I want to create. You're forced to pass in a input parameter here, which you probably could make a pretty easy overload to not have to do that. Then you get your results back, check for the very first one, get the value of it, make sure that it's actually a GUID. Very simple. XRM unit test looks very, very similar. I haven't wrapped this in a unit test method base, but you could if you wanted to. But because you're not actually connecting to the CRM, it's not necessarily needed. Initialize some test settings. I'm creating my actual workflow, and then I have a workflow invoker builder that I can go through and invoke my actual workflow. If you needed to pass in a service here, you could, but it invokes the workflow. Workflow could take the dictionary, it's optional, gives you back the results, and then you go through and do your actual assert. So very, very, very similar. It's kind of funny how similar they are, but I guess there's not much to it. So let's go ahead and test those. Next, let's take a look at some additional features here. So I'm going to take a look at assumptions first, and then entity builders. First, assumptions. This is a tool that's used to assume what exists in CRM. So you can use it to initialize your local CRM instance a lot easier. If you've got system setting data that you don't want to duplicate in your code, hard-coded in your unit tests, you say, hey, I've already got it out in CRM. I just want to use this particular value, this particular entity value. You can use it for that. It's very helpful for defining a system user, since you can't create a system user in CRM itself through the user test, through the unit test. So how do you handle creating it when it's running locally and not knowing when you're not running locally to say, hey, I don't need to create it in this instance, but I still need to refer to it. It does that as well. It will also verify that the CRM instance you're connected to, it contains the data that you're expecting. So this helps, for instance, if QA is working and dev is not, or vice versa. You can run it against those environments and it'll update the actual data that it's using based on that environment. It references, you can reference system settings stored in entity without having to manually maintain a duplicate for local CRM. So we already talked about that as well. They are easy to create. All you're doing is just defining the query to retrieve the entity. So these are based on the test settings. And primarily I just put it in my shared test space here. So here's my assumptions. And I've got this product install. So I've created this product. Let's say I have an install product that's going to exist. It has to exist in each environment. It's going to exist. And it's going to exist with a product number of install. So as long as I have gone through and I've created this class, I've referenced, I've inherited from the entity data assumption base attribute, and then I actually have a method to retrieve the data. It's pretty simple. It goes out, gives me back 3 pieces of information: product number, product ID, description, based on the product number equaling install. So that's all I have to do to do that. And then we actually have to run through and create it. When we run through and create it, it's going to automatically, there's that word again, it's going to automatically go through and create this product install XML file. It's going to be named exactly the same as the assumption, and it's going to contain the exact data that it pulled from CRM when you run it. So the first time you run it, you have to run it pointing to CRM itself. It'll grab it and pull it locally. You can check that into your source control, and then from then on you can run locally and use that data. So if we look at our test method here, assumption example, all I do is it's an attribute. So I attribute my class, say, hey, I'm going to assume that there's a product install here. And it's going to go and it's going to run, and it's going to go to get that, and it's going to just verify that it exists, that that description exists. So I go through and run my test. Okay, completed, great. So it went through and it grabbed it, it found it, and then it used that service to say, hey, let's go ahead and get that actual assembly. It went and actually got the product itself based on that assumed entities. And I think I'm going to change it slightly here to say, hey, this gets the actual, this actually gets the product. Be right back. Okay, I went through and grabbed the actual description from the product from the service. So not only am I getting it from this assumed entities, I'm also going to get it from the service just to show that it actually is in the service itself. And then I'd go through and compare the description as well, that the description of the product, that won't work. Stop. Cancel. The actual product description is equal to that description as well. And there we go. Finally, let's look at these entity builders. So entity builders, this is a way to go through and actually help define your entities for you automatically. It decreases the code required to create, defaults the values, and allows you to create custom, reusable, flexible, fluent methods as well. So if I look at my, that's my heavy unit test for create account should retrieve on it, yes. So this is one where I've got a builder in here for the account. So if I look at my builders here, once again this is set through that test initializer. If I look at my account builder, this account builder by default is going to say all accounts are going to be account number 10. And I also going to have a new method in here that's going to say, hey, I'm going to, with the address 1, I'm going to populate address 1. It doesn't matter what that actual information is, just says I have an address 1. That's an example of a way you can use that builder. But right now we're just going to I'm actually calling that builder. If I was, you'd be able to use that. But right now I'm just going to actually use that actual blah blah blah. What's the name of the test? Account number. There we go. Sorry, that actual account number. So my test is only assert because I've already done the arrange and the act up here. I've got the entities. When I do that with the entities, it's going to actually go and it's going to create the account using the builder for the account that's defined. The convention is you only have one builder per entity. It's going to go and use that automatically. And I'm going to go ahead and get the entity out and assert that, hey, I've got an account number and the account number is 10. So I haven't defined anywhere in here anything at all about that account builder, and it'll go and find the account builder for you and make sure that account number is 10. So just for fun, we'll put a breakpoint on there, run through there. Account number is 10. Great. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to let it finish. There we go. So that's another unit test that's passed. Okay. Next, code creation. So how do we make these things easier? How do we maximize our bell curve? So we want to be able to generate IDs as easily and quickly as possible. I have a link pad statement that I use. And it's pretty simple here. Just go through and say what entities do I need. Just put their actual types listed there. And go ahead and click run. And it creates me all these entities typed to that with custom GUIDs. And you may feel like you're wasting GUIDs, but just remember they're GUIDs. And I can take and copy that and paste it into my actual program wherever I'm at. So let's see here, my IDs collection. And boom. And I've got all my entities here. So that's one way to make your life a little bit easier. Another way, and this is probably the biggest one, is use snippets. So I've added some snippets to the actual GitHub repository, and allows me to do something like this. So let's say that I want to use the other address thing. So I'm going to type in CRM test method class, and then click tab. And then this uses the snippet, just like the property snippet that comes with C#, the region snippets that come. State being tested is create account, actually with address, should default address. Okay. Plugin name here, if there is a plugin, this isn't really a plugin name, so I think I'm just going to delete it. If I did same thing here. Yeah, normally you're testing a plugin, in this case we're not. with address should default address. I gotta give it a name. Let's call it class. Just to give it a different name, because I want to do this one. Okay. Normally I'm dealing with XUnit, so that's why you see this fact here. So it's a test method here. And you can tweak these as you need, but now I've gone through and it's defined my ID, just a generic ID. I can go and create my own. It's gone through and defined the initialized test data for me, and it's gone through and created my test class itself, or test method itself. So it's gone through and generated all that code for me with just me typing a few lines of code and helped me figure out, make sure what my naming conventions are and stick to my naming conventions. So that's something else I highly recommend as well, is to grab that snippet, take it, tweak it, and do with it what you need to in order to get it to be as beneficial as you can. It's pretty easy to do. And with that, we're done. If you have any questions or issues, by far probably the most reactive way that I respond to things is on Gitter. If you haven't used Gitter before, it's just a little chat client that's specifically for GitHub that allows you to have rooms for each project, and that's a great place to put it on there. If you have any bugs or any other discussion issues that you have that you think would be beneficial for the community at large, feel free to put it on GitHub as well. You can also find me at Twitter and on LinkedIn as well. So that's all. Hopefully you found this beneficial, and hopefully you've decided that now is a great time to start using the open source unit test we have. Go to GitHub and download it there if you want, or go straight to NuGet and search for it there. And that's it. That's all, folks.